Over time.
Watts. Composer over.
With Nick Verzi. Composer over time.
Watts.
Composer over time.
With Andrew. Over.
Composer over.
Composer and
Composer over time. Composer over time.
Andrew Watts.
Composer over.
Welcome to Composer Overtime. My name is Andrew Watts.
And I'm Nick Verzi.
Composer Overtime is a series of interviews featuring discussions and works by innovative composers across the world today. Nick and I are both composers and doctoral candidates at Stanford University and will be facilitating these chats each week, sometimes with Bay Area guests, and sometimes on location across the US and internationally.
During each episode, we will hear a new perspective on the contemporary music landscape, find out about the composer's creative process and musical background, as well as listen to some of their recent work.
This week our guest is Timothy McCormack, an American composer living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His music centers on the idea that sound has mass and is experienced as a physical object. His work also aims to create intimate social environments which prioritize communication, listening, and responsibility towards one another. Tim has participated in a number of top festivals and residencies, such as Schloss Solitude. Similarly, his works have been premiered by several leading ensembles today, including the Elision Ensemble, the JACK Quartet, Klangforum Wien, Ensemble Dal Niente, Talea, Ensemble Nikel, Ensemble Surplus, Musikfabrik, and Ensemble Recherche.
Tim began his university education in composition at Oberlin, and later studied at the University of Huddersfield with Cassidy and Liza. He has worked closely with Steven Takasugi, Roger Renoylds, Marc-André, Claus Steffen Mahnkopf, Amnon Wolman, Jason Eckhardt, Olga Neuwirth, and Philippe all major figures in the field. Currently, Tim is completing his doctorate in composition at Harvard with Haya Czernowin and Hans Tuchku.
It was a highly fruitful interview that will be broadcast in 2 parts and also available online unbroken.
Great, so let's dive right into it. Time.
So, welcome, Tim.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, it's great to have you here.
Yeah, just to paint the scene for everybody, we're currently at our rental here in the center of Graz for the Impuls festival. Tim just had a performance last night. So why don't we actually just start off with that performance?
Yeah, so why don't you tell us about the piece that you had. It was a premiere last night, right?
That was a premiere, yeah.
Yeah, congratulations on that, by the way.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, both Andrew and I were watching very intently and listening as well.
Nice. You got to do your homework.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the piece that I had premiered last night, all the pieces on the concert last night were premieres. It was a piece for 12 instruments for Klangforum Wien. The piece was called Sediment. It was at about 17 to 18 minutes. It was the shortest piece that I've written in about 4 or 5 years.
Really? That was 17, 18 minutes?
Yeah.
It actually felt a lot shorter than that.
Yeah.
All my stuff feels a lot, I think. I've been working on very extended, distended time scales for the past couple of years. And I think one of the reasons that I'm able to do that or whatever is that none of these pieces feel those lengths. I guess we can get into it more detail later, but I think it has to do with how I'm organizing time within this. It's sort of a different sense of passage of time.
Well, we can get into that whenever you like. We welcome tangents here.
Okay. Well then I guess I'm just getting right into it.
Yeah.
Let's do it. So how are you thinking about time? I guess in this particular piece, but I guess this is something that you've developed over the course of several pieces.
Yeah, many pieces. Well, there's a couple ways for me to answer this, I think. I mean, let's say 10 years ago, or a little less, the music that I was writing, I remember talking with people, and whenever we would talk about time or like tempo, specifically tempo, meter, all of these sort of more metric, more measured or counted senses of time, or ways of devices through which we count time in music, never really made any sense to me. And I remember always saying, like, I don't understand time. A lot of people say music is a
sound over
primarily a temporal time or art form, and I felt like I was missing something. Like, I just felt like I didn't have access to this understanding that it seemed like everyone else, every other composer or musician, had this understanding about time with sound, organized time. And I just always remembered excusing myself from that. Like, I don't understand time. But what I actually didn't understand, I eventually came to understand, is that what I didn't grasp was like tempo and meter and organizing time through these different, like, stepwise counted measurements of time.
So like a scale of sorts, something that is about the size of the units, but I imagine also has something to do with how the temporal space expands and contracts according to that.
But then also the fact that it is a measurement. Yeah. You know what I mean? And so, like the time signature matrices that I was using were matrices. They were arrived at through some sort of like systematic process that removed me from the decision-making process. Other composers that I observed from a distance seemed to like have a real understanding or a real grasp of like why this measure needed to be 5/8 and the next measure needed to be like 4/8 plus 2/3 8, or that sort of stuff. And that just never made any sense to me. Same thing, and especially with tempo changes or tempo modulations. Like, I've never been able to just feel that. And I remember in pieces, again, I'm talking about music that I wrote 10 or a little bit less years ago, I would make tempo changes because you got to have tempo changes.
Well, you have to start somewhere for one.
Exactly, yeah.
And also, I think that there's a desire for many years just to say you've done it.
To say you've done it, but it's also like...
Well, you have to try it.
Yeah.
You have to at least investigate it and see, like, is there actually something here,
Right. And also, if I'm talking about music that I wrote 10 years ago, I was in my like younger 20s. And, as composers, I feel like we all start at some sort of like base, and you slowly understand your own values as a composer. You slowly understand your strengths and what makes sense to you and what doesn't make sense to you, and how those can become strengths, And so, I would have tempo changes in my music, but you never heard them. Like, they never were, like, dynamic. I don't mean, like dynamic tempo changes. I just mean, like, they never seemed to have an actual, like, palpable effect on the time of the music. And, so it wasn't too long after that I realized that, like I said, what I understood time. It's just I was not understanding the instruments that I was using to work with time in my music. So I simply got rid of them. Tempo, meter, even like what I call like discrete rhythm, which is, like counted rhythm, metered, subdivided rhythm. I just got rid of it all. And for, I don't know, since, I don't know, when did I start doing this? Maybe like 2009 or 2010 or 11, somewhere around there. Everything that I've written has been in this sort of like time equals space proportionate notation. There is no tempo. There's no given tempo. There's sort of like each bar, which the bars in my score are like really light, like so as not to like impinge upon the material. Each bar is like somewhere around 9 to 10 seconds or so. But time is actually created. There's no stopwatch. There's no click track. Whatever. Time is. There's no conductor. Yesterday's piece was the first piece of mine, since I was an undergrad, that actually uses conductor.
Yeah, and I noticed also that the conductor was basically holding up numbered hand signals to show, like, I guess when you're moving from one measure to the next, or one like event space to the next, or something like that. Yeah,
each system, since it's time equals space, that time on the page is consistent. Yeah. But in other pieces, and also in the conducted piece, quote unquote conducted piece that you heard yesterday, just in a different way. But all the pieces that I've been writing in the past many years, time is kind of, instead of counted, it's like felt, and it's created in real time. And so, the musicians are listening to each other to keep together, and everyone, I mean, this is actually a different thing that we can talk about later, but they are creating temporal proportionate decisions together in real time, and that kind of gives a sort of not only a felt sensation of created time, but it also gives a sort of elasticity to time. It's not counted, it's literally like lived in. And so just to get back to where we started with this particular thing, my piece yesterday was the longest piece on the concert by a number of minutes, actually. But like, I think I can say this, a lot of my music from the past many years, that time scale isn't really felt in the way that other pieces that are also, most of my pieces from the past couple of years have been like 30 minutes to 70 minutes. But I think that time just passes in a very different way in what I'm doing, because there is no sense of it being counted. You're not counting time for 70 minutes. You're being in time, and you're shaping time.
Well, I imagine also that the sensation, like, let's say in the next performance of this piece, it's going to come out differently, right? It might be the case that, let's say it's like half the duration for whatever reason. You might actually feel it as being a similar kind
about
of
the
duration.
Same, yeah. It's funny that you say that, because most of my pieces, even though time is elastic or whatever, most of my pieces, if I'm lucky enough to have multiple people play them, everyone sort of eventually settles into the same general time.
So there's something about the music itself that is suggesting these times beyond just the layout.
Yeah, and I am writing it thinking like this event takes place over this amount of time, and because of the like physical underpinnings that go into performing my music, I think that anchors it to a certain time frame. But it is interesting. It's something that has been very consistent, whether it's a piece for 22 instruments or whether it's a solo piece. Witnessing the musicians like slowly settling in their time in the piece, it's just been incredibly consistent. Like the beginning of the learning process, these pieces are really, really long, and I'm like, oh my God, I didn't mean for this to take up so much time on the program. But then they slowly settle into this sort of more comfortable zone, and it's usually the zone that I intended for. But Yeah, so it's just interesting. Like I have a cello solo that's been played by 2 different musicians in the past couple of months. And
So did you write that for Severine?
I wrote that for Severine Bellone.
Yeah, I remember hearing that.
Cool.
And we both wrote pieces for her also.
Yeah.
She's very good at
She did a residency.
She's very good with time too, and like really
Yes.
understanding like when a gesture is finished and things like that.
I mean, her sense of touch and her sensitivity towards objects, primarily her cello, is so, I don't want to say refined because that sounds like, but it's just so natural for her. But that extends to her sense of time and phrasing and relating form. But so that piece is pretty consistently like 13, 14 minutes long. And then an American cellist, TJ Borden, recently learned it. And he's performed it twice now. And when we first did a run through together, it was like 24 minutes.
Wow.
And it was different, but it wasn't like crazy different for being 10 minutes longer. It still had that same energy. It still had basically that same form. And like you said a couple minutes ago, like the clocked time difference is dramatic, but the sensation of the piece remains fairly intact. Yeah, now, as TJ learns it, and this has already started happening, it's gonna compress. I mean, TJ is an incredibly like assiduous performer, and this cello solo of mine is called Drift Matter, is so detailed, and you hear everything that is in the score when TJ plays it, at least right now. Like I said, he's at the beginning, and I think what's going to happen, I think that's why it's really extended, because he's making sure that we hear absolutely everything. And eventually all of this like constellation of detail is going to sort of compress into a more like smeared gesture or smeared form, which is actually kind of what the piece is inducing a performer to do.
Well, the constellation becomes a constellation rather than a series of points or something.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's just interesting. I mean, not to just keep on drilling into this point, but another recent experience I've had regarding just this elasticity of time, or the more extreme ends of elasticity of time with my work. I have a bass clarinet solo called Raw Matter, and a couple of people have done it. Most recently, Richard Haynes, who I wrote it for, but then also Madison Greenstone, an American clarinetist. And that piece is pretty consistently like 18 to 19 minutes. But Richard and I took it into the recording studio, and instead of just a live recording, we could actually like break it down, and that affects how he plays the piece, because he's not thinking of breathing in the same way. Breathing is always not an issue, but a challenge in my work, because I guess I have a bit of horror vacui, like fear of blank space, fear of silence.
Me too.
Yeah.
It was something that I definitely had to like directly address at some point.
I've just continued to avoid it. No, I think
I'm on the same page as you.
Okay.
All my pieces end up being kind of like sustained energy for the whole time.
I mean, like I said earlier, like we have our strengths, and those are our advantages, and then we have our weaknesses, and those can also be our advantages.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it makes you an individual,
right?
Yeah.
So in this clarinet solo, breathing is a big part of it. And when you're performing live, it's a 20-minute piece where there's one literal silence where you're not playing, and it's like the first time that there's been like a couple seconds of not playing in a piece of mine ever. I'm making big steps.
Yep. Well, I mean, that is profound.
Yeah. Well, it was just finally the piece that I was writing asked me for that, and it was like the first time that a silence felt like it was part of that world. But anyway, so in a live performance, a performer has to think about breath in a totally different way, because they need to make sure that they can survive for 20 minutes. Whereas in a recording studio, Richard and I, in that studio, we made the decision to use this performative situation, the recording studio situation, to our advantage. And I mean, this bass clarinet solo has a lot of moments where you just can sort of like sit and like soak in this sound that's sort of just being, I don't want to say hovering, because I think that even though it's sort of hovering, there's still a sort of like impending momentum forward, even if it's really slow. But we didn't have to think about breathing in the same way. And so the point being, as a result, this piece, which has been consistently over like, I don't know how many clarinetists have done this piece, maybe like 4 or 5, consistently, it always settles into like the 18 or 19 minute range. In this recorded version, which, then you post on Facebook and it's like, here's the studio recording of this piece. And it's 26 minutes.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
But it's like very comfortably 26 minutes.
Yeah.
But then when you hear it live, it also feels very comfortably, 19 minutes. And
well, 26 minutes is like the superhuman version
is
of like the clarinetist who grew up at the top of a mountain and has that crazy lungs. So, I mean,
in the Olympic training camp version.
That's right.
So yeah, this is an aspect of my work that I've been that I really like. But then when you have to talk about it to people and also to performers who have to sort of reconcile this extreme window of whatever possibility, like the piece is possible at this duration, but the piece is also possible at that duration. I'm comfortable with this aspect of my work. I actually find it really interesting that it's that elastic and the piece doesn't become a different piece when it's 10 minutes longer. But it is sort of a weird aspect. Like, that's not something that I think we're used to in our world. Like, this piece, like the 10-minute window of elasticity, like that's sort of insane.
Yeah. And it usually suggests other sorts of works within our world.
Exactly.
Like, a minimalist work or something that's completely indeterminate, a John Cage piece or something.
Yeah. And my music is not indeterminate. It's very tightly knit. And so it is weird that it's occupying this that it has this relationship towards time. I think it's cool, but I'm still trying to figure out how to like make it like passable or something, just in conversation.
Have you ever tried to because it's interesting to note that there is some like essential similarity between all of the different performers who approach this, and I imagine that they're somewhat isolated from each other, because you had, especially with the clarinet pieces, like you had just posted the official studio version and all that,
Official studio.
Exactly.
It's dropping.
Dude, dropping the clarinet solo. It's coming out.
The world needs to hear this.
I'm sure they do. but there is something that's kind of implicit in the piece, by that logic. So have you ever tried to kind of examine what that thing is, like even just measure the durations within the different sections, and as you were kind of mentioning before, like maybe even articulating your own aesthetic as it kind of emerges from the process that allowed you to kind of express that in the first place?
Well, I think it has to do with, I have thought about this, and I think there's 2 things that come to mind. The first is what we were sort of already talking about, which is just this, it's it's not a measured, metered, counted time. It's a felt sensation of time. But I also think it has to do with proportions. I'm very proportions between sections or within sections are something that I'm really specific about. And there's something about how I proportion things out that, as long as those proportions are retained, so it's not like, one section has to be, if one section is like super condensed and the next section is super elongated. Yeah. Then we lose that sense. But as long as things are kept in this kind of like related zone.
Well, there are like thresholds on either side.
There are thresholds on either side.
And then within those, it's like, well, this one is roughly half the size of the other one.
Right.
Or
But the pieces are also written such that if you arrive at these really extreme thresholds, then you're actually not listening to the piece. You're not like you're making decisions that are outside of this world.
So that was Timothy McCormack's Raw Matter for solo clarinet. Thanks for sharing that with us, Tim.
Sure, thanks for listening.
Yeah, absolutely. We were just kind of talking a little bit about the inability to hear one of your pieces as an excerpt because you kind of need to feel the sense of time as you're going through it. And this one certainly seems like it's kind of like that also.
Yeah, and I mean this is the third point that I wanted to bring up when we were talking about time, which is like I think a lot about scale and rate, and like rate of information or whatever. And the way that I've been thinking of it is like most of my pieces take place on just like beyond a human scale. Mm-hmm. It's more like I think of it as like a geologic scale.
Oh, okay.
So like things are happening, things are always happening, but the rate they're happening on a scale that like us humans.
Well, if you were to sit there and kind of like look at a tree for like a couple hours, mm-hmm. you'd start to notice things that you wouldn't notice in your daily life,
and also just like how the earth moves. So I just mean like you need to, if you listen to an excerpt of a piece, and I understand my pieces are long, so for this radio show, it's fine for you to play an excerpt, but I urge my listeners.
No, we're happy to play the whole thing.
Cool.
And we'll also, for everyone listening also, we'll post we can repost your link on SoundCloud also, so everyone can hear that in full.
But just the point that I wanted to make is that like if you hear an excerpt, chances are you're not hearing the entire like process or life cycle that's going on. And if you take yourself out in the middle of that, it might very well sound like nothing is happening in this boring piece.
The piece is not necessarily suggestive of what the whole
thing is
perceiving.
Yeah, because I think we're listening very close up to it, mm-hmm. and it's only after time has sort of accumulated, and you slowly get this sense of like, I'm starting to get the sense of this shape or this object or
well, it's something about that, like listening through and living through that scale of time that mm-hmm. you begin to disassociate from, like, maybe this is kind of like that human thing. Like you begin to disassociate from that human pacing
level,
and you start to kind of like get on the level of the piece. So if you were just to kind of like drop it right in the middle, you need all of that build up in order to kind of sink further and further into it.
Exactly. And I think that that's one reason why these longer pieces of mine often, I think, don't feel their length, because when you listen to it, it's slowly sort of inducing you into how to listen to it. Mm-hmm. And it's at a certain point in the piece, maybe you don't even realize that you've arrived at this particular listening scale, but time operates differently, I think.
I think this is actually a good opportunity to pivot just a little bit. I'm just wondering, listening to this now, you had mentioned kind of the relationship that you have with time in regards to kind of like not really understanding what people were kind of really talking about when they were dealing with it and how they made their decisions. I'm wondering if you could kind of reflect back on some of the more formative pieces for you as a listener, pieces that not necessarily deal with this specifically, like maybe there was, or maybe they can be, but any piece that you felt was kind of like helped you gain an understanding of how you were going to explore this issue, or maybe other issues that kind of came up as a result of like similar pieces, or just things that were kind of important to you when you were coming up.
Yeah. Well, I guess when I was an undergrad, the big composer that I really, really loved was Fernyhough, particularly his like 70s and 80s and early 90s works. And that, I mean, if you listen to the stuff,
like Time and Motion Study, or
Time and Motion Study, Terrain was actually a really big piece for me. That piece. Yeah, great piece. Mnemosyne. But the things that I was relating to in Fernyhough's work at the time was very kind of like local and applied like very directly, aka I wanted to be Fernyhough. But then, I mean, I know that like many composers cite Fernyhough and or Lachenmann, as big influences. Lachenmann was another big influence, and it was maybe in his music that I first started thinking about form in a different way, which maybe has guided me to where I am now. I guess then, like, moving on, like a couple years later, some of the like 90s works by Peter Oblinger were pretty important, particularly Der Reigen, Das Glas, Das Lachen. Really, really love that piece. I mean, it's like a 20-minute glissando, basically, but the texture is so rich, and that process that's moving, it's still trackable, but just the resolve to just say, like, no, I'm going to do this one idea. It's still a concert piece. It's not one of his like Weisslich or something. Yeah. It's like, yeah. I'm going to do this one idea, and I'm going to elevate it through like how I'm using time and like orchestration and detail. And then more recently, I mean, it's not until like I've been writing pieces that exist on this like larger whatever geologic scale for a while, and it's not until after I started doing that I started discovering other people's music that really actually relate to that. So the big two composers from literally just the past few years, I guess I'm like late to the party, but Katherine Lamb I only started listening to her music maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, but like it really affected me. I don't know if it's changed my music, but it's something like I really relate to it. And then even more recently, Eliane Radic, like her work, I mean, what she's doing with time and scale is actually very different from what I'm doing with time and scale. Mm-hmm. But I hear something that really deeply resonates with me in both Kat and Eliane's, as if I know these people, Lamb and Radic's music. Mm-hmm. And then, again, I guess more recently, I've really, like, where I've found the most, again, I don't think it's necessarily inspiration, but just like
kinship
like and just like resonance with, within something really deep in me. Most of the composers are people that I like, like friends and colleagues whose work I've really gotten to know and respect. I'm thinking particularly like Michelle Liu, mm-hmm. Sabrina Schroeder, and Clara Iannata. All of these people, I mean, they're my friends, so I understand their music in a different way, but I also really, again, I don't know if like my music has necessarily changed because of them, but I certainly feel like there's some sort of conversation that we're contributing to. Yeah. And they kind of give me like strength.
I often think of my role as a composer within contemporary music mm-hmm. as a contributor. Mm-hmm. There's this small group of people, relatively speaking, compared to
community.
Compared to most other fields, and each work is an opportunity for me to contribute something. Yeah.
Like your voice provides another perspective on the same mm-hmm. issue, and mm-hmm. all of you are kind of chipping away at the same history or something like that.
And maybe a young composer, or maybe not a young composer, hears you doing something and it resonates with them, and it's like, oh, that's sort of something that I'm also thinking of, and maybe that gives them some like confidence to go forward. Mm-hmm. But probably, I mean, just getting back to your question, probably I hate to be like, oh, I'm a composer, but I'm not really influenced by composers. I'm influenced by other art forms.
Sure.
But honestly, like one of the biggest influences, like, and I mean influences, not just like, oh, this resonates with me, but it's like, this has profoundly affected my music.
Sure.
Is dance, particularly the work of William Forsythe and the Forsythe Company. I am a dancer, but I kind of came to dance through this impulse within my music, what I was trying to do with music. And when I discovered the work of the Forsyth Company, I saw them and I was like, oh my God, this is insanely close to what I'm trying to do with regards to like time and form, but then also, and I guess this isn't something that we've really talked about, but it's very much related to time for me. Inter-ensemble communication.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I kind of studied the work of the Forsyth Company for years until I realized if I want to understand them, understand like the physicality behind it, but then also understand its relationship to my music and how it affects time and communication, I need to just start doing it. And that happened to coincide with me starting my PhD and my university announcing the year that I started, they also brought in a new director of the dance department, and that was Jill Johnson, who is a former Forsyth dancer.
That's fantastic. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, she was working with Bill Forsyth, the choreographer, when the Forsyth Company was still the Frankfurt Ballet. So she's been there from like literally the beginning. And so I emailed her and I was like, I'm not a dancer, but I've been studying like academically for a long time, and it's really important to my music and blah 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 blah. Just like please, now's the time. Please let me do this. And she was like,
that's great.
She was just like, well, just come to the class, and if you can't dance, we'll find some other way for you to meaningfully take the class. But it turns out that I think I just, like I said, I'd been studying their work, not just their work, but like their vocabulary for so long from a distance academically. I feel like by the time I actually started studying it, it was just like lying dormant in my body.
Yeah.
And I ended up like dance became this other part of my life, but it also like actually dancing and feeling that type of physicality, the appropriate perception, like the awareness of your body in space, and also just what it's like to be inside one of these things. Like I said, in my work, time is really kind of created and sensed, but also shaped by the musicians together, and that's kind of what's happening in dance.
Well, there's also, like, to talk about the social aspect of it also.
Yes.
From my understanding, I used to, when I was at SUNY Purchase, there was a dance conservatory right next door, and had a lot of dancer friends and would often be over there. And the way that they rehearse is very
totally different.
It's completely the opposite of how musicians rehearse.
Absolutely.
But it reminds me a lot of the sort of thing that you're talking about, where there's nothing really written down. It's kind of left intentionally open so that you kind of, it relies on that putting it together based on feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah. I imagine that must have influenced you also.
Yeah. I mean, so obviously if, we've talked a lot about how there's no meter, there's no tempo, there's no outside or like external timekeeping device. There's no click track, there's no stopwatch. There's no conductor except for last night. But at the same time, as we've already said, my works aren't indeterminate. They're not, they're very detailed.
Well, they're particular. They're just, they have that.
There's a lot of, there's like an internal coherence.
Exactly. There's a lot of like maybe smeared counterpoint or relationships that need to happen. So it's like, okay, if I'm not doing any of that, then how are these people staying together and making this thing like audible? And that was the question when I like stopped using tempo and meter and like whatever discrete metric rhythm, whatever. The question was like, okay, but how are they keeping together? And it was the Forsyth Company. Not only, I mean, my music, we haven't talked about this much, we don't have to if you don't want to, but like my music has always been very physical. Like the physicality and the instrumental mechanism is like the starting point of, I think, the way that I think about music or my music. It's sort of like my access way into instruments and like the sound world. So that's why I may have initially gone to dance. But then once I like saw the work of the Forsyth Company, it's particularly this piece, One Flat Thing Reproduced, which I then like very, I think this is a very like composery or like young composery thing to do. I was like, this piece called One Flat Thing Reproduced is really important to me, so my piece will be called One Flat Thing Reproduced. And of course that piece is like my worst piece. And also like if you find a work by a different artist that you find very meaningful, don't title your own piece after that title. Like, interrogate your relationship with this other artwork, understand like why you're drawn to it, and then yield a title from your relationship with the artwork. Don't just take someone else's title.
Well, because in particular with this type of translation between the mediums, it's like the thing that you liked in the first place is lost when you reject the relationship.
Exactly.
You know?
So my point being, what I saw in the work of the Forsyth Company is dancers' relationship to time and counterpoint and relationships and alignments is very different from musicians from the get-go. But in One Flat Thing Reproduced, but I mean in all of their pieces, it was just very explicit in this piece. The dancers are keeping time through dance, through action. Mm-hmm. So, an actual event, an actual like physical gesture in the dance, in the work, also functions as an indication, as a cue towards other dancers for them to like start this passage or their some section. And it's non-hierarchic. Everybody can send a cue and everyone can receive a cue. Not every cue applies to everyone, Sure. But the piece is, they're all sort of tethered to each other. And I saw that and I was just like, I mean, I honestly, again, I don't want to be the composer who's like, oh, I'm more influenced by other art forms.
Sure.
But
many people are, I think.
Many people are, but it's also sort of a crutch, perhaps.
It's a crutch if it's, it can be a crutch.
It can be a crutch.
Yeah. I also think we're in a stage or a particular time in music history where a lot of creativity can be gleaned from trying to bring more things into music.
Absolutely, yeah. And so, yeah, like, witnessing that, seeing that in this dance company was one of the more profound, like, oh my God, aha moments. And honestly, I don't know how many of those moments I've had, like, studying, other music. Well, because I have, but,
But, there's I think one of the reasons why we're often attracted to things that are outside our own practice is because it's very easy to confuse a technical aspect with the main purpose or the essence of that music. So you might be influenced by like the sound world as opposed to the temporal space or something like that, or the social interactions.
Right.
So like, you don't have that temptation when it comes to dance, for example.
Yeah, you're just like, looking at like pure like, sensation. Or
there's no clarinet there. You can't like say, okay, I think I'll try out that sound.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, you're not bothering them for like multiphonic notation.
No,
yeah.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, I witnessed this and it was like, oh my God, like this is exactly what I've been working towards in my own music. And so that's what I've been kind of refining ever since. I mean, the first piece that I wrote using this sort of like, actual sounds in the piece also double as communicative cues towards other musicians. The first piece that I wrote was One Flat Thing Reproduced for oboe, violin, and percussion.
Perfect.
Not my favorite piece of my own, but it was sort of more of, I now see it as sort of an experiment. It was the first time that I tried this, and but that's what I've been doing since. And I have a piece from a couple years ago called Karst, which is 36 minutes, 22 instruments. And that whole thing, there's no conductor. They're all listening to each other. Everybody, the way that I think about it now, we were talking either on or off the record, I can't remember. We were talking about the social aspect of music making, which isn't, I don't think it's really talked about that much. But that has become a really big part of why I do what I do. In having, the musicians have to listen to each other in a different way. Of course, musicians listen to each other. We have to blend and relate to each other or whatever. But this is a different type of listening that's invited into the process, where every musician in an ensemble piece shares a responsibility towards everyone else. Mm-hmm. And I think about it as they have to sort of care for one another, mm-hmm. and in return they are also cared for.
Yeah, well, and often those aspects are kind of like they're in all music, and they're there out of necessity more often than not. Mm-hmm. And then once you acknowledge that, you can actually build it in, I think, in the sort of way that you're talking about.
And so this also gets to what I mean when I say time is elastic. Mm-hmm. It's not elastic because I don't use tempo or meter. It's elastic because the musicians are listening to each other, and because of the way that they are tethered to each other, it's, if someone makes a decision to take more time or whatever with their thing, that has a rippling effect. Like that decision is then affects maybe 3 more musicians, which then in turn affects 5 or 6 more musicians. And mm-hmm. that decision from one person to take more or less time or whatever to shape something in a certain way has this like rippling effect over maybe a couple minutes. Or maybe a minute or something.
It probably affects the rest of the piece, Like,
yeah.
I mean, definitely on small levels.
In a smaller level, in a smaller level that doesn't disrupt the aforementioned proportions that are happening, but there is this agency that everybody has, and if I've done my job right, I've organized it such that they can have this agency without it being disruptive.
Or they can sort of indulge the feeling to the point where they don't have to limit themselves, mm-hmm. and they can still remain within the boundaries of what works.
And everyone is there with them.
Yeah.
Eventually at mm-hmm. least, So engineering that elasticity is, it's elasticity that's coming from communication between musicians and listening. And that's something that I really value in my work. The fact that like the act of listening and the act of communicating is almost like a material mm-hmm. in the piece.
So Tim, we've been talking about how time is a very important element in your music, and the malleability of time that's been kind of a common thread for many years now in your music. Could you tell us a little bit about how you started in composition?
Yeah, I started composing music, I guess, in middle school. Let's see. I started playing music. Okay, let me rewind. The reason why I'm a musician, I'm the youngest of 4 children. My mom, she's not a pianist, but she played piano as a kid, and she always had a piano in the house. And she's not a musician, but that experience with the piano was always really meaningful for her. Also, like her father, my grandfather, bought her this piano. They didn't have any money, but he bought her this piano because she really wanted it. And I feel like it was always a familial connection. And so she really wanted all of her children to learn how to play piano. I'm the youngest of 4. All of my older siblings, sorry if this isn't exactly how you wanted me.
No, this is great.
All of my older siblings were made to study piano, and it was like this like mean old woman down the street who would like, if they made a mistake, she would like take their fingers and like bash it into the right note.
It's just as bad as the whole like wrapping with a ruler or
something. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like, of course they're not musicians. Their first interaction with like serious music making was terrible. And so with me, the youngest always kind of gets away with everything, and I don't know, my mom was at that point, she was just like, you can do whatever you want, and I was like, cool, I'm not going to learn piano because it's scary, but then when I was, I don't know, how old are you when you're in middle school, like 12 or something?
Yeah, 12, 13.
Yeah. So it was band, like there was the first time you choose your instrument, and my sister played percussion in band, and so I wanted to play percussion because I looked up to her or whatever. And then the next year, I started learning piano with my kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Bielitz. And I was like, oh, Mrs. Bielitz, she's cool. She's nice. She's fun. I'll learn piano if it's with her. And And then I just sort of like, then the next year I started learning flute, and I just sort of like became this omnivorous, somehow bassoon became my main instrument, but that wasn't until high school. It's like the last instrument that I learned, and that is what became my main instrument. There was like oboe and guitar in between that too. And I don't know, it was just, I learned all these instruments to various degrees, and at a certain point, I don't think anyone specifically encouraged me to start writing for them, but at a certain point I just started writing for them, mostly piano, but also some flute. And I just find it funny. I mean, the reason why I gave you all that like family information is just, I find it funny that I am the only person that my mom didn't make try to have some sort of relationship with music making, and thus I'm the one who like
well, it's your choice, right?
Once I was ready, I did it, and yeah. Once my heart was open to me.
That kind of thing works out.
Yeah.
I remember elementary school music classes. I have 2 younger siblings. I have a younger brother who's 2 years younger and a sister who's 8 years younger.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, 2nd, 3rd grade elementary school music classes, I got C's. Because I just refused to participate in anything. I couldn't stand what they were doing. To me, it wasn't music. As a 7-year-old kid, I would just, they would do like little dances and hoedowns, and I'm like, this isn't music. Like, what are you guys doing? This is a dance class, which of course, as you mentioned before, you dance, but
watch what you say.
There's nothing wrong with dance, but I feel like that's not what I signed up for. As if I had signed up for anything. But
when I was in high school, I became the first senior to be demoted to the junior band because I was quacking the major scales. I was sick of the morning warm-ups and everything like that. It happens.
So I don't know when I forget, I started writing music at a certain point, and at another certain point that sort of became more serious for me, and I didn't know what it meant to be a composer. Like, I had no idea, what that actually meant as far as like going to school and then existing in the world.
We don't run into composers.
You don't run into composers when you're 15.
I mean, we run into composers.
We run in, no, but
now
when
we
you're
do.
young,
But when you're coming up, it's you were too many composers. But when you're kind of just starting out, it's more like, oh, there's a sound, I'll write that down,
right?
And then what comes after that?
And you're just sort of doing what you want, and that's great. And but at a certain point I was like, no, I want to be a composer. I want to like write music. I want to go into school for that, or however I thought of that decision. And my mom was just, I don't think that she understood what that meant exactly either, like practically. I mean, it's not practical, but we also didn't understand that it's not practical or practical.
It's like a vague impression of like what it might be.
But my mom has always been like just super, super supportive of me. And so when I said, when I got more serious about composition, and, I decided that I wanted to go for undergrad for composition, she was just right there with me. She thought that was cool and that I should follow my dreams or whatever. Very, very supportive. And I never had any composition teachers. I showed up at Oberlin. I went to undergrad at Oberlin, and Oberlin, I think that this is fairly unique, just the way that they've designed their curricula, at least like when I was there, 15, whatever, more than 15 years ago. They're able to, their freshman composition class is actually really big. I think I had like 20 composers in my class.
Just the freshman class?
In just the freshman class,
wow.
And so, and you also take classes. You don't start private lessons until your 3rd year.
Wow,
which I think is the way to do it, because I had bassoon teachers and piano teachers, but I never had a composition teacher. I was just doing what I wanted to do. I didn't know anything. And if I had been thrown into a private lesson situation with like Randy Coleman or Louis Nielsen when I was 17 or 18 or whatever, I don't think I would have known how to use that.
Well, you have almost nothing. Well, you need to develop like a reservoir of like raw things that you need to feel about before you start to intellectualize about it.
Exactly. And also learning from your colleagues is just like incredibly valuable. Like just like learning together. And so that was the first 2 years at Oberlin. And I showed up and a lot of my colleagues at Oberlin went to art schools or something, and they had composition teachers.
Stuff, yeah.
And so it was actually very intimidating for me. And I mean, there's no right or wrong way to go about, being a composer or whatever, following your dreams.
Composition in particular is one of those things where everyone sort of comes late to it. Yeah. I mean, like many of us start off as instrumentalists or multi-instrumentalists like you, kind of like you're attracted to so many different things, and then you kind of, I don't know, when was it for you, Andrew? It was probably like
when did I start composing?
Yeah, like after high school, or
I started
like
composing in high school. Yeah,
yeah, but it's like again, like during high school, it was about the same for me too. Yeah. And it's kind of like whereas as a violinist, you start when you're like right out of the womb,
right?
You're like you're just like ready to go.
Yeah,
but like
think you're practicing your ricochet bowing like
that's right.
in your infancy.
Well, think of who you were probably when you were 17, 18, 19 years old, like we're all kind of jerks who think that we get it, like we know ourselves and we know
nobody
the world.
Else gets it quite like I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I mean, I definitely was that. However, I also think, I was dropped into this big composition community at Oberlin where a lot of people did have previous experience. And I think I postured in a different way, but inside I actually felt really vulnerable. Mm-hmm. But now looking back on that, I'm really happy that it worked out the way that it did, because I feel like, I mean, I could be wrong, but I feel like some of my colleagues who had previous training in composition before getting to college felt like we're confident down to the core. And really, like when you're that young,
that's a problem.
When you're just, that's sort of a problem. And I'm happy that I didn't know anything as far as like actually studying this and formalizing your thoughts about it, because
it's a bit wiser.
It's a bit wiser. Yeah. I mean, like I said, I certainly postured in a different way, because it's a really vulnerable situation. And when you're young, I think the way that you deal with that is like coming off stronger than you really are.
Yeah.
But inside, I feel like, I mean, I remember one of the first questions that they asked us, just to like kind of get to know you, is like, what's the weirdest thing that you've heard in a concert or whatever? And
that sounds like a recipe for a competition.
Definitely. Like everyone trying to one up themselves or each other or whatever. But I, like my little Cleveland suburb library we got John Adams CDs. So I like listened to those. But the weirdest thing my answer was, it was a video of the Cleveland Orchestra playing this orchestral piece, and it was like really, really dissonant. And I don't remember the name of the composer, and like we'll probably never know what this piece is, but it was called Atmospheres. And my teacher was like, "Oh yeah, that's Ligeti," and I was like, "What? Like, how did you?" Of course, knowing nothing.
It's like almost
a genius.
Yeah, just like, oh my god, like. So of course, then like a week later, we looked at Atmospheres, or whatever.
That must have been a great moment for you.
It was a great moment.
Suddenly, it's like when Andrew and I are having a conversation the other day. It was just yesterday. We were at dinner, and he heard like some punk song on the radio. He's trying to remember the name of it, and it's like, it's going to drive you nuts until you finally find it. So when you finally put it together, it's like, oh.
Well, it was also just like, oh wow, this crazy thing that I thought was just like an aberration of like, or whatever, like, oh, I just witnessed this thing that no one, like, why would anyone know this music? And then my teacher was just like, oh no, that's this. It's like one of the most important pieces of the 20th century. And I was like, good. Oh, okay. Another, you can cut this out if you want, whatever. No, but another just like formative experience is I went to the Cleveland International Piano Competition. And for me, like, I was playing like Bach and Beethoven, like on piano, like that was really music. And the music that I was writing was like an irresponsible knockoff of that.
Meaning that it was like it was like different? Totally,
no, irresponsible like meaning like I didn't understand music theory and chord progressions and like...
But you understood the sound.
But I understood the sounds and like the gestures of like the Bach inventions. So like I wrote some things that sounded like that. Anyway, so I was at the Cleveland International Piano Competition, and I will never forget this moment. one of the pianists was playing, I think it's the 10th regard, Messiaen's like regards.
Yeah, that's a great piece.
Yeah. And it's the one that's like really crazy and like these like block chords that's like do 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 do.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And
there's some great.
I had never heard anything like that. And of course, Messiaen is like, if your ears choose to listen to it in this way, like it sounds vaguely tonal, but the pianist is making a lot of mistakes. Accidentally adding with clumsy fingers. And so the whole time it's like a 10-minute piece, and it looked like the pianist was almost like crying, but I realize now that it's just this insanely physical piece, and it takes a lot. Your body is kind of just put through the ringer with it. Anyway, I spent the whole 10 minutes of this piece like sinking lower and lower in my seat, when you're like embarrassed for someone and thinking that she was making mistakes. And I was like, girl, just stop and start again. This is painful. And then at the final, the final end of the piece, she hits the final chord, and immediately, like not a second later, the entire room stands up and applauds and is like wooing and like this, and that moment, after spending 10 minutes of thinking that this person is a bad pianist and playing a bunch of wrong notes and this is so embarrassing, please just stop and start again. And then and being like utterly confident in
your
that
worldview
and then
collapses.
That moment where everyone gave her this immediate standing ovation, no one else got a reception like that in the entire competition. So it was like a moment. It was maybe one of the most profoundly confusing moments of my life, and it was that moment where I was like, okay, I don't know everything. This is something that I don't know anything about, and this is a world that I don't understand.
Well, it's also like you were so confident in your reaction to it.
So confident in my reaction to it. And so that was a profoundly confusing moment. And you got to have those moments where your rock solid belief in your own like values or understanding of the world is just like utterly called into question. So that, that was a formative moment.
So I'm interested in hearing more about your compositional process. Do you start out, more of a pen and paper guy, or are you on the computer? Are you writing on an instrument? How's your entry into a work like?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure all of our processes, there's lots that informs it. But for me, every piece that I write is sort of contributing to this larger thing that I'm building with my like sound world or whatever. So there's very, very infrequently is a piece I feel like coming from some totally other zone. So everything builds off of each other for me. It's really, really important. I mean, the instrument for me is everything. Like I mentioned earlier how like just physicality, but then also instrumental mechanism is sort of my initial gateway into a sound world of a piece, or just like the possible sound worlds of an instrument and how they might like resonate personally with me. And so it's really, really important for me to get my hands on an instrument, or to have like really, like intimate working relationship with, you know what I mean? A close working relationship with whoever I'm writing for. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's like uncomfortable for me to write for an instrument that I've like never touched, that I don't understand how a certain sound is being produced. It's an incredibly uncomfortable situation for me. I really have to know how you produce a sound, what you're doing with your body, what the instrument is doing, the conditions of the production of any certain sound. And that's just how I think about it, and that's how I reflect it in my notation, and that's just how I think my brain works. And so the instrument, long story short, is like the beginning of it for me, especially if I can get my own hands on it. But also just more abstractly, like the instrumentation is like, once I know what the instrumentation is, like once that's been settled, usually just whatever that collection of instruments is, there's immediately a sound world is sort of there. And it might be sort of inarticulatable. It might be just this vague impression, but it's enough to sort of like guide me to a point. Mm-hmm. Not only the sound world, but also quite frequently, once I know what the instrumentation is, there's also a form, or like this vague suggestion of a form that I want the piece to
That can be tricky though. I mean, in my experience, certain instrumentations will immediately suggest an approach for me. Mm-hmm. And then other instrumentations, often like more generic instrumentation, mm-hmm. like it takes way more out of me to mm-hmm. have that approach. Mm-hmm.
Well, it can also be a danger. I mean, like, so let's say you have kind of a wonky instrumentation. Your first impulse is probably a good one. But if you have like, well, I'm writing a string quartet. Okay, string quartet. Like this is going to come out sounding like a string quartet. Yeah. That can be like a dangerous thing to follow.
That's a really great comparison. So we've both written for Rage Thrombones, mm-hmm. which is a trombone duo. That's a very atypical instrumentation. So having that as the restriction was very easy for me. Because mm-hmm. I'm like, okay, I don't have to worry about too many things. Like I'll just think of my approach and that will be it. Whereas string quartet would be very difficult for me.
Well, you don't know if you're like lapsing into a cliche, or if you're
right. And also just like what do I have to say about this instrumentation? Yeah. I'm not saying it has to be like earth-shatteringly original necessarily, but I still would like to going back to the term contribute. Mm-hmm. I want to contribute something different.
Yeah. I mean, this sounds cheesy, but I mean it full-heartedly. You have to follow your heart, like that impulse that you have that speaks personally to you. Like that's where that's where the answer usually lies. And of course it's informed and like padded out by my past experiences with the instrument, my past experiences with the musicians that I'm writing for, or just the musicians that I've collaborated with along the way that have informed how I write for, whatever instrument. So string quartet, is actually a really resonant thing for me. I have 4 string quartets, all of them written for the JACK Quartet, mostly through like educational residencies, except for the last one. And so it's not only like for me, string quartet. Yes, of course, the string quartet has this history, but for me, the string quartet is more about my relationship with these 6 individuals over time, you know, and each of these pieces are really different from one another. I mean, for me, they're really different. For someone listening to all of them, they might be like, they're basically the same. But, and each of them has added on to this, like with each piece that I've collaborated on with the Jacks, it's like we're building our own history of collaboration that's evident in, that is evidenced by these pieces. One of the most recent string quartet is, I actually just finished it. I started it in 2016. Half of it was premiered in 2017. And then I just finished it like a week or 2 ago.
Wow. Congrats.
Thanks. So that's like an hour or so, maybe a little bit more. I haven't like added up all the like supposed time units. And then the shortest piece that and in comparison, the third piece that we worked on is 3 seconds long.
Wow.
But it is a piece.
Okay.
You know,
It's
like
an intense 3 seconds.
It's an intense 3 seconds. And actually, a little side note just about working with the Jacks. So the idea for that piece came out, even though it was the third piece I wrote for them, it was the idea for that piece was sort of born at the pub after the premiere of the first string quartet that I wrote for them. So I'm talking, the first one is called Restoration of Objects. The third, this really short one, is called Containment. And we were at the pub, and like the Restoration of Objects it's my first like real statement as a young composer. My music is very, very different now, but like at the time it was really important for me. And it's one of those pieces where like I was thinking about physicality and notating action instead of sound. And so it's, each instrument is juggling like 4 different staves, and each stave is a different physical parameter, and each physical parameter is notated through like really specific complex rhythm, and the meters are changing, and blah blah blah. A lot to think about, a lot to juggle, and maybe not super like calibrated to how humans deal with information. But we worked on it together. It was a good experience, and in the pub after the concert, I said to them, I have this really weird idea, but like, go with me here. I'm thinking of this piece, this string quartet that's like really, really short. I think at the time I was like 8 seconds. And I'll never forget it. Chris Otto, one of the violinists, who's just like, oh my God, like one of the greatest human beings. I had proposed this to them really kind of like timidly, because it sounds like it could be like, really like 3 second string quartet.
Right. Like a novelty or a joke.
Yeah, a novelty or a joke or something. But like I was serious, but I kind of presented it to them with a little bit of vulnerability. And Chris, like his eyes got really wide, and he like sat back in his seat, and he goes, whoa, wait. So like, because with your music, we rehearse one measure for like a long time, and we get it, but then there's like 150 more measures. But if the entire piece was basically just like one measure, we could really learn that piece. Wow. And I was just like, oh my God, these guys, these humans are the best humans.
They're forces of nature.
And so they were really interested in that. And anyway, whatever, that's a totally different. What I meant to say is, for me, it's instrumentation and who I'm writing for. If I don't know who I'm writing for, it's kind of difficult. I really like to have some sort of like established relationship with them, or not established relationship, but just like get a sense of who they are as a human, get a sense of who they are as a musician, and just how they think about things. And I don't know if that necessarily like changes what I write. It does a little bit, but
it probably gives you some sense of clarity on
yes.
how the idea will come alive.
Exactly. Yeah. And so when I'm writing for string quartet, even that first piece, when there wasn't this history that I was building upon, I was less concerned. Like, it didn't freak me out that there's this like history that I want to contribute to. It was like, I'm writing for these people. I want to articulate this idea, and I'm doing it with 4 strings. So yeah, for me, the beginning of a compositional process really lies within the instrumentation, and that immediately like suggests a sound world and a form that I want to articulate. And it's, I usually don't write out like maps or this will happen here and this will happen there. I kind of keep it in my brain because I also want there to be the room for reacting against what I'm writing, I mean, when I was younger, I kind of thought that I needed to have my answers before I started writing the piece, because the piece needed to be a sort of like foolproof, whatever articulation of an idea. And eventually, at a certain point, I realized, like, wait, no, I'm a composer, I'm an artist or whatever, and I think about these questions. I answer the questions through writing the music. The pieces don't need to be these like airtight arguments or articulations of an idea.
And they might even be more airtight the more you actually interface with the material as you're constructing the form.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, writing music is how I think about music. It's an articulation of how I think about sound. And so I might have a very like, the instrumentation or whatever might provide for me a really clear impression of these things, but at the same time, I definitely allow myself to react to what I've written. And sometimes the pieces, like, I have a violin and cello duo, which was the most surprising piece I've ever written. Like, every day where I ended and where I picked up the next day was like completely different from where I thought I would be that previous morning.
Interesting.
And the piece, I mean, this piece of mine is called "You Actually Are Evaporating." It's a
great title.
Thanks. Well, that's a Forsyth quote, like from an interview from this choreographer I mentioned earlier.
Cool.
And if you listen to that piece, it's almost like a diary of, like, that is the piece. If you listen to all my music, like, chronologically, that is the piece where you hear my music swing from this, like, in terms of its physicality and its relationship to the body. The beginning of that piece and most of the pieces that came right before it, the physicality is like it's an enactment of physicality. It's like putting this palpable corporal energy out there, more frenetic, more active, whatever. And then by the end of that piece, it's like my music has transitioned, and you hear the transition over those 24 or so minutes. And so that was a particularly surprising compositional experience. And yeah, I guess I've had a gradient of experiences between that and, like, no, I know what the piece is, and in the end the piece is sort of a direct articulation of that initial impulse.
Interesting.
Oh, I was just going to say, the bells are going off now, but
I don't mind the bells, actually.
I just wanted to respect your time. We have 15 minutes.
Okay, great.
So do you want to say the last question?
Yeah,
We can try to wrap it up in like 5 minutes, and then I'll take the headshots.
Sure.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I mean, so you've talked quite a bit about sort of these different threads of consideration that have started it in your early work and kind of reached different points of epiphany throughout your process of kind of developing as a composer. And I'm just curious, considering the trajectory that you've been on and the types of things that you're thinking about, what is it that you're very interested in right now? And maybe you could speak a little bit about if you're composing a piece at the moment, or if you have plans for pieces in the future, anything of that sort.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have plans for pieces in the future. More generally, I mean, and I'm happy to talk about those, but more generally, with my work right now, I think I'm sort of in I now that I've been composing for a couple of years, I look back and I see these, this like pendulum swing back and forth. There's like usually like a couple of years, like maybe 2 years, where I feel like I know what I'm doing, and these pieces that I'm like producing off of that are like really clear articulations of an idea, and they're very confident in what they are. And then all of a sudden, I don't know what causes it, maybe just the passage of time and slowly becoming a different person, but all of a sudden, like, I'll start writing pieces that by the end of it, it's like, well, what is this piece articulating? I don't fully understand it. I need to write the next piece to start understanding it, you know? And I feel like I'm sort of in that zone. I have a vague impression of I know what I'm doing in the next pieces, but I don't fully understand how, like, what they're doing as a collection.
Sure.
Versus like I said, like these other stretches of maybe 2 years where I know what the pieces are doing and what they're contributing to together, you know?
So the works are providing a lot more questions than answers for you.
Yes, very much so.
You're like writing the edge closer or something. Like the mystery that you're after is a bit more immediate as opposed to sort of like remaining in a space that you feel very comfortable in or something like that.
Yeah, and I guess just put really bluntly, I feel like it has something to do with, I mean, the past couple of years, most of the pieces that I've written have really embraced just like almost like a drone noise element. And the movements that the pieces do make take place over such extended periods of time that if you just drop yourself in for a couple of minutes, it's almost like nothing's happening. And I think what is happening now is that I want to take that language, like the slowness, the feeling of impending motion, but bring more local detail, local movement into it. I mean, that sounds like it should be super easy or something, but it's just something that I'm figuring out. But not every piece will do that either. Like, not every piece that I'm writing in the next couple of years will do that. The piece I'm working on right now is a horn solo for Samuel Stoll. And that is actually like heavily just like drone noise. But then again, me and him have been working on this piece for a couple of years. So it kind of has its roots back in this more like confident time. And then the main piece that's been sort of tracking this maybe it's a shift or, you know, whatever, not shift, but just this new development in my work is a big piece that I'm writing in collaboration with the Elision Ensemble from Australia, as well as Line Upon Line Percussion in Austin. Great. So it's a collaboration between the three of us. It's a piece called Kiln. I've had the idea for it since like 2014, and it's like happening. And it's a piece for 10 instruments, percussion, like soloist, and then 3 percussionists, and then what does that leave? 6 low pitched instruments. And it'll be a sort of concert installation, by which I mean, you know, it's a piece, it's a set piece. It'll probably be like 80 minutes or so. The musicians are dispersed throughout the space in a very particular way, and the audience is sort of sitting within the pockets of that. And but it's actually 5 smaller chamber pieces that kind of interconnect in certain ways. I mean, when I say smaller chamber pieces, the shortest of these pieces might be like 25 minutes. The piece Kiln, the whole thing, like I said, is probably going to be like 80 minutes long. But if you put each of these pieces end to end, it's something like 3 hours of music that I'm writing. Yeah. So
it's sort of like a multiplicity that's overlapping or something like that.
Yeah, a couple of the pieces, they either overlap, or 3 of the pieces are literally like played on top of one another.
Oh, cool.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
But they're their own pieces. And so there's a percussion solo, which was premiered last September. There's a percussion trio that I'm writing later this year. And then there are 3 mixed trios, percussion and 2 low-pitched instruments. And those are the pieces. So 2 of the 3 of those mixed trios have been written. And those are the pieces where I've most clearly seen like glimpses of something happening that I can't fully articulate or understand yet. Which
Glimpses of the future.
Glimpses of the future, yeah. Which is sort of funny because they are part of this larger project that I've been working on for years and will continue to work on for another year. So they need to fit in amongst these other things, and it's this big project, and I want it to be like this, confident statement, but at the same time, these pieces are like, I don't fully understand them, actually.
Oh, but that's exciting.
It's kind of cool. Yeah. It's kind of weird. It's kind of funky. My heart is open, but yeah, it is sort of a weird, vulnerable space, but that's fine,
That's where the best art is made, I think.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah. So that's another piece that's on my. It's been on my table off and on for a long time, and
wow.
hopefully we'll be able to hear the whole thing sooner than later.
Yeah, we look forward to following up with these works.
Me too, man. Yeah. Me too.
Well, thank you so much, Tim, for chatting with us today.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's been a lot of fun. Yeah.
I had a great time.
Yeah. Well, until next time.
Yeah.
That was our interview with Timothy McCormack, an American composer living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. More of his music is available at timothy-mccormack.com. That's timothy-mccormack.com.
If you would like to hear more episodes, new interviews are broadcast on the radio, Friday at 2 p.m. Pacific Time, through KZSU 90.1 FM, as well as on Composer Overtime's YouTube and SoundCloud. Zero.